Good afternoon. So nice to have you all with us. Welcome to you. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Thank you and welcome to tonight's wonderful guests, Larry Diamond and Jeffrey Koseff. This is a very important topic, as anti-Semitism on college campuses has been at epic levels over the past year. So we are beyond interested to hear you speak about your study results and your recommendations. Of course, thanks and welcome also to our wonderful moderator, Larry Mantle. Reminder, Nick Kristof was called to Africa. He was supposed to be our speaker next Wednesday. He's covering the war and the famine at the Sudan-Chad border. So that program, which was scheduled for September 11th, has been postponed. We'll let you know when he will be joining us. Next week's program is therefore on Thursday, when we welcome veteran Middle East State Department negotiator Aaron David Miller, now of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He will be able to give us an up-to-the-minute briefing on the status of the negotiations for the hostage release and the ceasefire talks, and so much more. We have 6 additional programs scheduled for September. In that poll, about a month ago, everybody said they would attend 2 programs per week between now and the end of election season. And we have split the programs evenly pursuant to the responses to the poll between Israel in crisis programming and domestic politics. So we have some great political programs coming up. We have the Bulwark Sarah Longwell and her Democratic counterpart Simon Rosenberg. We have Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, and we have legendary documentary filmmaker and astute observer of all aspects of American life, Ken Burns, all coming up in September. And then we have several Israel in crisis programs with speakers from a variety of perspectives, including one which brings together Biden's and President Bush, the younger one, senior Middle East advisors. So be sure to look at the program list in the email you'll get tonight and sign up for our September programs. You're also going to get a copy, hopefully it's without a paywall, of the dueling editorials by Tom Friedman and Brett Stevens about the Philadelphia corridor. I think you'll find both of their perspectives interesting. Certainly, they take 2 very different points of view, but both worthy of being read. All of our programs are available via podcast. You can visit our YouTube channel or our website. Links to all of our past programs are in every email we sent. And you can always go to our website, which is JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org, to find any past program. We encourage you to send our links and our emails to your friends, especially as the November election comes upon us. It's really important to have an informed electorate, and our programs do just that. They inform everybody who listens. And by the way, despite what some of you think, because I do get a lot of emails from you, we have a very diverse audience for which we are very appreciative and grateful. We're not all Democrats. We're not all Jews. We are divided between Jews and non-Jews, Democrats and Republicans, and non-declared voters. So it really doesn't matter what your perspective is. We just have great speakers on all these important topics. Now to introduce and engage our guests tonight, please welcome the amazing Southern California and beyond icon, Larry Mantle. For almost 40 years, Larry has hosted Air Talk, which is the longest running daily talk show in Southern California, which airs on NPR's member station, LAist, formerly known as KPCC. He is a highly decorated superstar, and we are so grateful that he's one of our regular moderators of America at a Crossroads. Larry, the program's yours.
Janice, thank you so much for those very, very kind words. I appreciate it, and I look forward to these programs, whether they're Wednesday, Thursday, over the weekend. So many important topics, as you were just saying, and a remarkable assemblage of guests that are available to us with these free programs. We're just very, very fortunate. And tonight, of course, to take on a topic that is as difficult as anti-Semitism, that is full of all kinds of challenging legal issues, as well as moral ones, of course. And we're going to dive into those with our very special guests. And we know, of course, that anti-Semitism on American college campuses has been a significant problem since the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel and Israel's military response in Gaza. Our guest spent 6 months chairing a subcommittee devoted to understanding not just how Jewish and Israeli students, faculty, and staff experience Stanford University, but the potential chilling of speech on campus for all students, not just Jewish or Israeli students. The panel's research included more than 50 listening sessions with a wide range of people associated with Stanford. That included parents and alumni, not just people who show up on campus every day. And what they heard wasn't unique to Stanford, but was in line with similar accounts from prominent universities across the country. Larry Diamond and Jeffrey Koseff are with us this evening to detail the findings of their subcommittee and to answer our questions about anti-Semitism in American higher education. Larry Diamond, who you're probably familiar with, previous America to Crossroads programs, is a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's also professor of sociology and political science. Jeffrey Koseff is professor of civil and environmental engineering and oceans at Stanford. He's also a senior fellow at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Jeff and Larry, so good to be with you this evening and to have you share the results with our audience. Let me start because, like many other universities, Stanford has been the site of a pro-Palestinian encampment and protests since soon after Hamas's attack last fall. These schools have heard accounts of anti-Semitism and a chilling of diverse opinions about Israel. But what specifically precipitated Stanford's creation of your subcommittee?
You want to start, Jeff?
Sure. Well, a couple of years back, Stanford had an investigation into allegations that there were sort of an anti-Semitic admissions policy that was sort of pervasive during the 50s and 60s, which led ultimately to the creation of a committee on Jewish life at Stanford. So when this October 7th event occurred, they took that committee and then created a subcommittee of that committee, this Committee on Jewish Life, and asked it to focus specifically on the questions that we addressed, which is sort of characterize the state of anti-Semitism at Stanford and then make suggestions or recommendations about what to do about it. We then, when Larry and I assumed the leadership of this subcommittee after it was formed, we expanded the purview to include anti-Israeli bias. So that sort of is the way this committee came about.
Let's talk about some of the incidents that were detailed in these many interviews that you had with members of the campus community. And Larry, do you want to share just a few of them? I have to admit, when I was reading your report, I got so angry. I mean, it's just so, I can't imagine what it was like for you to hear these accounts from members of the community, but share a few of them quickly, if you would, please.
Well, I want to begin by saying, if you want to get even angrier, read the report of our sister committee at Columbia University, which was just released and posted a few days ago. I don't think Stanford is even close to being the worst instance of this problem in higher education in the United States. We haven't had the instances of physical violence that have occurred for the most part, we have not, at Columbia and at UCLA, which many of your listeners on this program, which is, after all, based in Los Angeles, will be familiar with. But, you know, students have had mezuzahs torn down from their door frames. They've had swastikas posted on pads on their door. They have, we had a Jewish student who wrote about this problem at Stanford, who's a very famous student journalist, and actually won a prize for investigative reporting for his reporting on ethics questions involving our previous university president. And we have a social media channel that students, that is not moderated, and that therefore is a sewer for a lot of hatred and prejudice and venom. And someone wrote, "You should be waterboarded with petrol and lit on fire." It was suggested that a Jewish student in another social media post had been elected to the student senate only because of a Jewish cabal. And this is part of the problem that goes back millennia in terms of these tropes about hidden Jewish conspiracies of wealth and power. And these tropes frequently surface in dialogues calling for boycotting and divestment from Israel. So I could go on, but I can say that in many, we deliberately didn't use the term pervasive, which Columbia University's committee did. We don't think it's in every part of the university. We don't think it's a raging problem in every single school and dorm, but it was shockingly widespread and often created an environment that made it difficult for Jewish students to learn and feel part of the community.
Larry, I just want to say, because I think his work is known to many of the viewers on this program tonight. The student journalist you're speaking about is a George Polk Award winner, one of the highest honors that you can get, and he is the son of two famous American journalists who were regulars on these programs,
Yes.
Peter Baker
Theo
and Susan
Baker,
Glassman.
yes.
This is Theo Baker. I've had the privilege of interviewing Theo on my program as well, because the work that he's done for the Stanford publication has been just tremendous. So to hear this kind of thing directed at Theo is particularly enraging. Jeff, as you were interviewing people and hearing these accounts, did it surprise you, or was this very much in line with what you expected as a professor to hear from students and other members of the community?
Yeah, I was shocked. Just was shocked beyond words. I've been at Stanford for 47 years. I came as a graduate student. I was fortunate enough to be hired as a faculty member. You know, I've encountered a lack of understanding at times, or appreciation for Jewish issues, or issues that Jewish students experience at Stanford. And I've heard the complaints. You know, we've had an ongoing issue about starting class on Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, which is now being fixed. But those kinds of things were going on. There were instances which we document in our report of anti-Semitism at Stanford from time to time, going back, you know, ever since I've been on the campus. But nothing, I can tell you now, nothing prepared me for hearing the kind of expressions of utter shock and just helplessness and isolation that the students were feeling. They were besieged, almost besieged by a sense of just being isolated and marginalized. It was almost like it happened within 24 hours after the tragic events of October 7th. It happened almost.
It started right away.
It started right away, and they didn't even have part of the problem, and what we try to address in doing our interviews was give students a charge, and faculty and the community a chance to grieve, to actually say what was on their mind, because they didn't. It was so relentless and so ongoing that no one really felt that they had a chance to even process what happened at October 7th before they were relentlessly accused of being, of essentially being the perpetrators. So it was shocking, and I never thought in all my time that I would ever experience this in the United States, let alone at Stanford. I'd experienced anti-Semitism growing up in South Africa, but I'd never ever thought I would see what I saw at Stanford in that time.
Larry, were students at all or others in the community reluctant to talk with the subcommittee, or were they, in fact, looking forward to being able to tell their stories and to be able to share it with people who could potentially do something about it and bring it to wider attention?
Well, to use a much invoked word, we encountered a lot of diversity. In this case, diversity in student experiences, attitudes, and readiness to share them. Some students welcomed and deeply appreciated the opportunity to convey their experiences and felt an intense need for it, and a very powerful frustration, Larry, with what they felt was the failure of the university. And not just Stanford, but it's been a very common experience across American universities to really acknowledge and respond to the pretty obvious and overt experiences of anti-Semitism that they were encountering, things that I've described to you, having to denounce Israel in order to be admitted to a student party, having the word Zio used as, a not very clever or subtle kind of stand-in for Jew. She's a Zio, so you shouldn't associate with her. You're being taught by a Zionist, which is the equivalent of Jewish professors. So drop this class, a leaflet under a door in a class that was actually in the middle of being taught. And a lot of people wanted to share this. Others were cynical, didn't believe that anything would happen, were afraid, were intimidated. We experienced really quite a lot. And, some students were traumatized and didn't particularly want to relive it. So we experienced a very wide panoply of attitudes and responses. And then I might add, there were a number of students who didn't experience anything themselves in their own lives, but had students, friends of theirs who had.
And you get into as well, not just Jewish and Israeli students, but other students who talked about a chilling effect, as though you had to have this, one opinion about the conflict between Palestinians and Israel, and that was the only thing that was acceptable. We'll get to that, but your report states, we rejected the idea that safety requires protecting students from views that might make them uncomfortable. So what are examples in attempting to draw this line between protected speech and something to make someone uncomfortable to hear a contention versus something that an objective third party would perceive as a threat of physical harm? Is that, in your mind, a clear demarcation for either one of you?
You want me to go ahead, Larry? I'll go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah,
ahead,
it's
Jeff.
it's a very, very, very difficult issue. In fact, one, that Stanford appointed a committee on free speech to address that, among many other issues. It's our view is that, look, we need to be able to have difficult conversation. We need to be able to have conversations where our opinions are widely divergent. We need to be able to say what's honestly on our minds, but do it in a way that's respectful and do it in a way that's non-threatening. And unfortunately, what has happened is we've lost that ability, or we haven't nurtured that ability as well as we should. And that's part of the challenge going forward. I mean, if somebody wants to make remarks critical of Israel, and that is their right. If those remarks then cross into anti-Semitism, as they sometimes do, and that's another difficult issue, then that's a different issue, and we need to be able to call it out. So protect free speech, yes, but do not hesitate to call out vile and reprehensible language when it occurs. So you can protect free speech, but we can be critical. The other thing is, we need to be able to sit in a room and confront one another with these divergent views, in a way that people do not feel like they're going to be victim of physical violence, or they're not going to be physically threatened. Feeling uncomfortable because of somebody else's views is not a bad thing. It challenges us and it helps us grow. So we need to learn how to do that and promote that at Stanford. So there is this civil discourse, but civil discourse should not be about just things that are easy to talk about. Civil discourse should also be about things that are very difficult to talk about.
Let me give you an example. So let's say, and you have students from Israel. So this is about, the future of their country. And you have a student who tells an Israeli student, I don't believe that your country has a right to exist. I think that Zionism is essentially oppressive colonialism. And I think, that there should not be a Jewish Israel. And I mean, is that an acceptable position for a student to take when, they're saying essentially, hey, I don't think your country has a right to exist, at least as a Jewish state?
Well, it's legally acceptable. It's protected speech under the First Amendment and the specific extension of the First Amendment that was passed by the California legislature, I think about 20 or 30 years ago, called the Leonard Law, which requires universities to afford private universities, public universities were already required. Private universities in California to afford all their students the most far-ranging protections for freedom of speech that are currently, protected by jurisprudence in the United States. But that doesn't mean it's morally acceptable, or it doesn't mean it's the kind of tone that the university shouldn't, call out, question, discourage, and so on. I do want to say, Larry, I think it's really important to understand that threats of violence and physical intimidation are not the only kind of speech or behavior that is unacceptable, morally unacceptable in the university, and potentially a violation of Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which makes very clear that universities cannot harbor without dedicated steps to reverse and confront it, a hostile environment for people based on their racial, ethnic, sexual, or other protected identity. And oh, by the way, that includes people whose nationality invokes a particular minority religion. That includes Israelis. And under California law, you can't discriminate on the basis of employment in that regard either. So universities face both moral and legal responsibilities here to do much more than I think most universities, or at least most elite universities, have been doing.
But it sounds like there's the potential for some pretty clear conflict between Title VI, a federal law, and the Leonard Law here in California. Back to the example that I used, you've probably got significant numbers of Stanford Jewish students who would hold the view that there should be one state that's one person, one vote, which essentially means there would be no Jewish Israel. And could also mean that the future of Jews living in the region would be threatened. But so this isn't just other than Jewish students who would hold that view. So I guess I'm trying to figure out, how do you have a conversation with people who hold that perspective, but in a way that isn't a threat to a student?
Let me just say, I think these historical conversations are necessary. I think we need to do much more teaching about Israel, about its creation, why it was created, the history of the conflict. There are competing interpretations. They should be allowed to be heard and should engage one another in a civil fashion. But a lot of the people who are saying that they believe there should be a different reality in the Middle East, one state for all peoples, are not advocating that as something that should be achieved through some process of dialogue and negotiation. A lot of the people who are shouting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, are then going on to celebrate acts of violence and even terrorism as justified resistance. And we heard that in the immediate wake of October 7th. And that is the glorification of ethnic cleansing and violence, which I don't think universities should let pass without at least calling out morally.
You mentioned, I think that you didn't try to define anti-Semitism, which is difficult, and even American Jews have a wide range of views on how you define anti-Semitism, with some things virtually everyone would agree with, other things that might be subject for debate. In not defining that, then what onus does that put on administration to try and curb anti-Semitic activity or statements?
Yeah, so Larry, we did not define it, and it was clear from the beginning that the makeup of our committee, if you chose the three competing definitions, there were going to be differences of opinion, and we felt like we had a short 6 months to get this done, to get the report done, to do all the work. And we didn't feel like we wanted to get into Talmudic discussion about, which was the apt definition of what anti-Semitism is. So what we did was as I said before, we expanded the purview of the committee to include not just anti-Semitism, but anti-Israeli bias, which we felt then would cover some of the ground that some people felt would not be covered if we adopted one definition of anti-Semitism versus another. That said, chapter 2 of our report is a distillation of a brilliant essay written by our colleague Ari Kelman, who's a professor in the Graduate School of Education, which is a very nuanced and a very detailed discussion about anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, how they relate to one another. I think it's well worth reading for anyone who really wants to understand more about it. It's not, it's not something you can do while standing on one leg, understand the whole Torah while standing on one leg. It demands a lot more nuance and research to really get at it. So we didn't feel like we wanted to get into the middle of that and create a potential division in our committee's work. We wanted to get on with it, but I still think we dealt with it, and I think we dealt with it in the right way, both tactically in changing the name and expanding the remit of our committee, and then also intellectually by including this chapter in our report.
I think one of the things that surprises many observers of the elite schools that have had such challenges here is I think we've had, and I'll speak for myself, my assumption was that one of the major roles of the elite universities is to help students in some ways uncouple emotion from argument, and not to be non-emotional, not to be automatons, but to understand that to debate things, to have different points of views, mean you can't swarm the other person with emotion and always be making the "what about the children" argument. And it doesn't seem like that's happening. It seems like emotion is just allowed to carry the day and to run roughshod. So why is that? And why has this not been sort of an embedded tenet of particularly high level American higher education? How did this go lacking?
Well, read the work of Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, and
who's been on these programs also. I should just go.
It's just absolutely brilliant, and the coarsening effect that social media and a certain kind of perspective on pedagogy in the United States have had on civil discourse and, the kind of universities and schools we should want, where people need to grope to understanding, almost fumbling in the dark sometimes, through reasoned debate and fact-finding and fact-checking, and what we call in the initiative we have at Stanford, which many universities in the US are now pursuing, civil discourse and civil disagreement, which means civil in the sense of decent, mutually respectful, not drowning in emotion, moral certainty, and righteous anger and name calling. And in the quest for some kind of reasoning behind the positions we have, and a willingness to have our positions subjected to critical inquiry and respectful challenge and debate. And I will give our provost, Jenny Martinez, a lot of credit for prioritizing initiatives at Stanford that are trying to pursue this. But Larry, I want to mention one other thing. I think that a lot of this stems from a growing tendency it's a larger problem of political and social polarization that infects our politics and that infects our society and that propels binary thinking. People are completely wrong or completely right. And in the context of the new form of anti-Semitism in the last, I'd say, at least 2 decades, the anti-Semitism of the left, that divides the world into colonizers and colonized, oppressors and oppressed. And if you're white, you are by definition, or almost by definition, a colonizer. And we had a teacher in a freshman class shortly after October 7th. This was one of the most shocking incidents of anti-Semitism, who diverted from the curriculum in his freshman class one day to, not long after October 7th, to physically divide the class into colonizers and colonized. And
Was that professor disciplined for that?
I cannot really comment on whether the person was disciplined or not. I can only describe what happened, that when 3 Jewish students complained to high-level university officials about, I saw their letter, what I think was simply outrageous and unacceptable conduct in the classroom. The instructor was put on leave without pay. And then after some months of investigation and so on, his contract ran out and it wasn't renewed. So
I
I'm
want to
not
go
sure
back.
that.
Okay,
Yeah.
I want to go back.
Yeah.
You just mentioned Provost Jenny Martinez when she was dean of the law school, and they had a very unfortunate incident. A conservative judge was in speaking, and it was shouted down, and the representative of the school did not handle the event well, then Dean Martinez wrote a memo, which I thought was fantastic, about the importance of free speech, keeping emotions in check to be able to have rational dialogue and acceptance that other people have a right to share their opinion. And then shortly after that, she ended up being named provost of the university. But I thought, as you're saying, it was quite a remarkable piece of writing and so clearly laid out the principles that you're talking about. I want to go back to this framework of colonizer and oppressed, because I think that this fits into a little bit broadly to some of the things that we hear talked about in DEI programs, for example. And it's sort of the idea that when you have a conflict, the moral high ground is held by the person who either has less power or has less financial means. And so there's sort of a quick cut to the moral judgment of the person who has suffered has the moral high ground, which seems kind of anti-intellectual, but we hear this argument made. So how can schools institutionally fight back against what's kind of a frankly just dumbed down approach to conflict, and make it a more thorough, more nuanced, and actually perhaps more solution-oriented approach to conflict?
Keep going, Larry. You'll go.
Well, I think that all forms of binary thinking, you're with us or you're against us, you're an oppressor or you're oppressed, are anti-intellectual and dangerous, and at least need to be subject to critical inquiry and interrogation and rational debate. And the skills and the reflexes and the disposition to search for and welcome mutually respectful debate, honest differences of views, I won't say completely laying aside, but the restraint of emotions in the quest for, rational, empirical, fact-based argument. It's a tool that we need to develop. It's a muscle that we need to build up. And it requires training. It requires practice. It requires socialization. And it requires, I know you always ask us to finish by saying something positive. I'll say something positive right now. Unfortunately, I'm not sure I'll have anything else positive to say at the end. But I see a lot of universities now, Larry, at least, and a lot of university leaders who have grasped that this is the core overarching priority, is to build up these tools and norms of mutually respectful civil discourse, evidence-based argument, and critical inquiry.
Let's talk a bit about your recommendations here specifically. One of them is that when it comes to the university's diversity, equity, and inclusion program, that there be very clearly stated that Jewish members of the community, as well as Israeli members of the community, are deserving of the same protections of other groups that have been targeted for attacks. And you say that's short term, essentially, but longer term, you argue for something that's sort of beyond DEI. And so what is that longer term place that you would like to see the university get to?
Yeah, I think our colleagues who on the committee who took the lead on this issue, Paul Brest, who was the former dean of the School of Law twice, and Emily Levine, who's a truly outstanding scholar, also in the Graduate School of Education. They just published an opinion essay, guest essay in the New York Times on exactly this topic. And that is, we need to sort of revisit our approach to how we deal with what is an incredibly important issue. And I think the criticism that we had was not about DEI per se. And unfortunately, some people felt that the way our report was structured, that we came out against the concept of DEI. We don't, not at all. But the way it's being, as you pointed out, Larry, implemented in many cases where certain groups are perhaps excluded or feel excluded or not included in the issues, is not working. And we heard that from a number of staff members in particular at Stanford. So there are a number of different models that are being put forward. One is Daniel Allen's, confident pluralism and things like that. So people are rethinking how to do it, how to go about it. And so what we're encouraging is a thorough examination of the different models for doing it, and perhaps an overhaul in doing it. It's not just about including Jews in the process. It's about rethinking how we do it from the ground up.
I'm going to start with some of our viewers' questions because they're always so excellent. And this one's from Nick, who asks, why aren't the colleges enforcing their constitutional time, place, and manner rules? Why is Vanderbilt, he thinks, the only college that expelled students? And he also asks about criminal prosecutions. That might be beyond what you'd be willing to get into here. But there were rules in most of these schools against encampments being set up and people standing overnight in quads. So why did the colleges allow these to go on?
I think there's a practical problem, and there's a leadership problem. The practical problem is that, as some universities discovered, they couldn't enforce their policy against encampments without calling in the local police. And if you look around, there are different communities in different places. Not local law enforcement around the United States doesn't always want to come onto a university campus and be asked to enforce this policy. And you do lose control of the situation as a university administrator once you've called in the police or the sheriffs or something like that. But that problem at UCLA, at Columbia, and then to some extent at Stanford, reached the level that it did because they didn't act immediately. And then you get to the second problem, which I need to emphasize is not shared by all the members of the subcommittee that produced the Stanford report. So I'll just speak for myself. I think it's a lack of courage and a lack of backbone and a lack of conviction and a long-standing reluctance to enforce accountability. Oh my God, what will we do will ruin their careers, will ruin their lives if they're suspended or expelled. And I will just say, I have a great deal of respect for Daniel Diermeier. I think he's the chancellor of Vanderbilt, which offered me my first teaching job. So I feel a little bit of partiality there. But I think he's been a model of courage and conviction. And Larry, it's a little bit like cancer. If you act early, it's going to be easier to treat it and contain it and hopefully prevent it from metastasizing. And
you have to be willing. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
If you don't act early, it's gonna gain in size, it's gonna gain in momentum, it's gonna gain in moral sympathy, and it's going to become embedded in social and cultural life, and it's going to become much more costly and difficult. My advice to every university president in the United States is, within an hour of the tents going up in violation of your university policy, remove them and make it clear that the students who construct them will face serious disciplinary action if they don't respect the rules.
Just, on behalf of the chancellors or presidents, though, in the case of USC versus UCLA, so Carol Folt, the president of USC, acted pretty quickly the first time an encampment went up at SC. The Los Angeles Times, you said, this is a terrible example, students should be allowed, and praised UCLA and its chancellor for allowing the encampment. So here you've got media that's praised the UCLA model for allowing the students. The encampment continues to grow. Then we have outsiders at UCLA who come onto the campus and attack people that are in the encampment. And there's not enough police, enough law enforcement to come in to stop when the attack happens for the very reasons, Larry, you're just talking about. It's lawsuits waiting to happen for law enforcement. Administrators don't want to bring law enforcement on campus unless they absolutely have to. Here, the chancellor's been praised for allowing the encampment, so keep police away. And now you've got the violence that happens at UCLA. So what is the president or chancellor to do in that kind of environment where everybody's critiquing what you're doing and telling you different things?
Yeah, well, I think come back to Larry's word, which is courage. If you have policies and you're convinced that they are the right policies, you enforce them without, well, the press will obviously have its opinion, but history, is not judged after one, we don't use one editorial or one comment to judge, So if you look at what happened at USC and UCLA, while in the short term, Gene Block might have taken a lot of flack for shutting down that encampment if he had. In the end, it might have been, history would have judged it in a very different way. So I think courage means exactly that. If you have policies and you feel you should enforce them, you should enforce them and not wait for what the Los Angeles Times tells you to do.
You also we're talking about, Larry, you said that you admired that Vanderbilt actually expelled some students. My sense of protesters in earlier generations, and not to put too much of a gauzy glow on it, but that the thought that you might be arrested or that you might be suspended for that sort of factored into the protest. How many people said, yeah, I may not be back for dinner, I may be in jail because I'm taking part in this protest. It seems like students that protest now don't expect any kind of consequences from that. And so how did that happen, that we went from a generation that expected to be arrested or that they would be thrown out? And that was part of the trade-off. That's part of what makes it powerful, is that the stakes are very high, that you can suffer consequences versus, no, I should be able to do this and I'm inured from any sort of response.
Well, a lot of these students claim to have studied tactics of nonviolent civil disobedience and the civil rights movement and the teachings of Martin Luther King, but they haven't really. Martin Luther King never defaced buildings. Martin Luther King would not have broken windows to break into the president's office at Stanford University, and he wouldn't have climbed up on furniture to cover up the cameras inside the building. And Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi and other practitioners of the change-making tactics of nonviolent civil disobedience wouldn't have written the shameful, hateful messages, both against Jews and Israel that were in a lot of the encampments, but also that were defacing the venerated sandstone columns and walls of the inner quad of Stanford University with, I don't remember the exact language, but the word pigs, which I thought that we had banished as a vulgarity from the 1960s and early 70s, made a return appearance, and maybe with the double entendre of an additional insult against Jews.
We have a number of viewers, Bob, Terry, Bruce among them. What could be done about radical professors, those that demonize Israelis, that laud Hamas's violence? Why are the professors who encourage the misconduct not facing any kind of discipline? You commented earlier about the professor whose contract was allowed to run out, but what about other cases?
Well, they are faculty at Stanford, and I'd rather just focus on our own campus for the moment, but who have been very critical of Israel and who teach classes in which they are critical of Israel. And, under the academic freedom and freedom of speech, they have the right to do that. The onus on us is to counterbalance that programming by having classes that offer different perspectives, and to ensure that the curriculum and the requirements of the curriculum are balanced so that students are able to get both views. I don't think shutting down that kind of, and I'm not talking about praising Hamas, and I'm not talking about that level. That's a different issue completely. But if people want to teach classes critical of Israel, as has been the case at Stanford for many years, that is their right. I think Larry has been one of the leaders on campus in promoting programming of a different kind and inviting other speakers in to offer a different perspective. I think that's the most important way. I think we need to counter it. Now, when somebody crosses, to me, a line and promotes the ideals of Hamas and praises them as sort of a legitimate organization, when the government of this country classifies them as a terrorist organization, that needs to be dealt with in a different way. I don't think that can be tolerated at all, and that needs to be called out when it's done. And if faculty don't want to abide by that, well, then there are disciplinary processes for dealing with that. But I am very skeptical about just shutting down classes or speech or opinions that we don't agree with and perhaps are offensive, unless they cross a certain point. I just think the best way to deal with it is to offer vigorous and pervasive, if you will, counter programming and counter courses that students can have access to, that gives them a different set of opinions on the issue.
And Larry, I'll just say
Sorry.
that this is why we're building an Israel Studies program at Stanford. I think UCLA has one. UC Berkeley has a very high-profile one. Give students a variety of perspectives and counter, false narratives and bias with more truthful or at least different for this consideration of the students and more complex histories and narratives about the realities, so that you can get our students. It's one of the major imperatives of higher education, to transcend binary thinking.
What is there a difference in calling out this sort of not just anti-Semitism, but this sort of anti-intellectual refusal to allow people to really debate important public issues? Is there a risk in what administration does here because of the Leonard Law, because they speak for the institution, that it can be seen as somehow chilling speech, versus what a professor says, for example, that she or he is maybe speaking on their individual behalf versus what the president of Stanford says? And, how does that factor into an institutional response?
Well, we often noted in our dialogues, we heard noted in our listening sessions, and we discussed in our report what is a kind of double standard. I've been reading the report of the Columbia Committee at Columbia University, and they make a lot of this as well, that very grotesque expressions of bias that would never be tolerated and would be instantly denounced by university leadership if they were directed at Blacks or Hispanics or the LGBTQ plus community. People just shrug their shoulders when they're directed at Jews or Israelis as a nationality group, for example, in one program where one, I think, extremely anti-Semitic student suggested that all Israeli students had blood on their hands for having even served in the Israeli Defense Forces. So university administrators also have freedom of speech as well. And if they are going to call out bias and prejudice directed to some groups, they should call it out directed at other groups as well. And not refrain from doing so just because some people argue that that group, the Jews, are really just all oppressors, and they do it on the basis of ignorance of the vast diversity within the Jewish community and within the nation of Israel.
We're almost out of time, but I do want to ask Judy a viewer's question. A single state is raised by some Jewish groups, such as Jewish Voice for Peace. However, many pro-Israel organizations see even raising that issue is anti-Semitic, calling for a single state in the region. So what do you think of that, again, given that among American Jews, there is significant difference of opinion here? Maybe a distinct minority who hold that one state view, but there's certainly, and particularly on campuses, Jewish students and faculty who hold that view.
I personally do not think it is intrinsically and invariably anti-Semitic to offer the opinion that at this point, given the extent of the movement of peoples and settlements and so on and so forth, that the only viable, sustainable, and just outcome is a single kind of binational or multinational state. I don't think that's intrinsically anti-Semitic. I think it's intellectually and politically, if you know anything about the history of such binational states and have studied ethnic conflict and democracy and so on, as I have, I think it's intellectually unsustainable. But I think it should be subjected to rational argument. And I will repeat, the problem is the people who advocate that often are, they claim to be kind of proposing some kind of democratic process by which this could miraculously descend. But when you get past the very initial expression of this opinion, it often takes on the emotional sweeping character of from the river to the sea, if they can remember which river and which sea, Palestine will be free and Israel should be forced or coerced into oblivion. And we know what's behind that.
Let's wrap with each of you just very briefly, 30, 40 seconds, just sort of what you hope best scenario comes out of the report. Jeff, you want to take that first?
Yeah, I think, we have a new president at Stanford, John Levin, and Jenny Martinez is the leadership team now. I hope that and I know they both have read the report thoroughly, that they take our recommendations and they act upon them. I know they have a second set of recommendations from our sister committee, the Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian one, but I think they need to create a climate. We need to return to the values and the culture that we believe that Stanford was built on, and they need to lead us there so that we can rebuild the trust in our community. That's basically our recommendation, to return to the culture and values that made our university so great. And they need to lead us to that. There's a lot of things to reconcile. There are a lot of differences of opinion, in terms of discourse, vibrant discourse versus civil discourse. But it's now at the time for really incredibly good leadership that is consistent and ongoing to get us to that place. We're not asking for anything remarkable other than just to return to the values and culture that we hold so dear.
Larry, just a quick close, please.
Yeah, most fundamentally, Larry, we need a change in the culture to return to the principles of tolerance and pluralism, that there is no essential one right answer. You asked about DEI. What it needs to be replaced with is respect and embrace for every identity, and with an emphasis on the fundamental dignity and equality of all individuals, no matter their race, their historical background, and the assumptions, correct or not, about what kind of privilege they may have had in their life. And one thing that's making me optimistic is I see more and more university leaders who now recognize what the ultimate goal is, that the core values that used to guide and inform higher education, if I can say, in liberal democracies throughout history, need to be rediscovered and defended.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much for talking about what I know was such a huge part of your life for these many months, and all the people that you talked with within the campus community, and alumni and parents on top of those that come to the campus there in Palo Alto. Thank you for talking about your work and your hopes for what it'll accomplish. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Larry. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you both
Indeed.
very much.
Yeah.
And thank you for joining us on the program this evening. I just want to remind you that we will be back with you next Thursday, a week from tonight. There is no program Wednesday night of next week because Nicholas Kristof has been called out of the country and not able to be a guest. But I will be with you next Thursday with Aaron David Miller, the noted negotiator who served in multiple administrations, Democratic and Republican. He's a tremendous analyst of what's happening in Gaza and in the Middle East generally. We'll be talking about negotiations over the release of the Israeli hostages that remain, and also about Israel's prosecution of the war in Gaza. That's next Thursday, 5 o'clock Pacific. Aaron David Miller. And if you appreciate these programs, as I know so many of you are, because I hear from you, Janice hears from you, Zev and Mel get tremendous feedback on what these programs and these guests and topics mean to you, please consider supporting them financially as you can. This is a nonprofit organization, an incredibly lean staff. You'd be amazed with all that Janice does to keep these programs coming. Please make your tax-deductible contribution to JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. That's JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. Thank you for being with us. Have a very good rest of your Thursday evening.